I am indeed Mehdi Hasan, sitting in for Ian Dell every night this week from between 7 and 10. It's Monday night, it's 9 o'clock, that means it's the LBC Book Club. We've got two very interesting books and authors to talk about today. We're talking coalition politics, and we're also talking cricket, or should I say spin bowling. I can honestly say I know more about one of those topics than the other. You'll soon discover in this hour which of those I am less familiar with. We've got two very interesting authors with us today. We've got Mark Gill, who is the co-author of Explaining Cameron's Coalition, How It Came About, an analysis of the 2010 British general election. Mark is a former head of political research at Ipsos Mori, now an independent research consultant, and he is a co-author with Robert Worcester, Roger Mortimer, Paul Baines. Are they all Ipsos Mori, Mark? Are you all...
Two of them are Ipsos Mori. One of them's an academic.
And of course, yes, Bob Worcester, of course, is one of the most famous pollsters in this country, the doyen of opinion pollsters.
Sir Bob Worcester, I think you'll find.
I think it was Lord, Sir. I can't keep up with what titles he has. And this book is all about. It's one of these books that's a lot of people wait for. You know, it's come a year in the more than a year in the making. And that other voice, by the way, I should say, is Amol Rajan of The Independent, former deputy comment editor, and he's author of the book Twirly Men, The Unlikely History of Cricket's Greatest Spin Bowlers. Good evening, Amol.
Indeed, very good to be with you, Mehdi.
So we've got Amol and Mark here. We're going to kick off with Mark's book, Explaining Cameron's Coalition. Give me a summary, Mark, dare I ask, of what some of the main themes are in the book, what you picked up over the year, with the benefit of hindsight, of last year's fascinating election.
This is a book not just about the general election, of course. It looks back all the way from 2005, what happened during the Parliament, how Tony Blair dug the hole for the Labour Party, what happened when Gordon Brown became Prime Minister, and so on, the impact of the expenses scandal of the economy, and the rest of it. I think there's some really key insights when we look at what happened at the election, not only understanding what happened a year ago, but what it means for British politics and what Labour have to do to get back power, and what the Tories and the Lib Dems might need to do to retain power in 2015. I think one of the most important things to come out of this is leaders are much more important now. The image of the party leaders are much more important than they ever have been in determining which party wins the power. And that's the first time since this polling began where the public were even saying that what they thought of the leaders mattered more than what they thought of the party's policies. You
refer to the new presidentialism in British politics. So you're saying it's really that new, more than the Margaret Thatcher era, Tony Blair, etc.?
Sure, because one of the ways academics, commentators often talk about British politics is presidentialism. Well, actually, we still have a party-based system. Most people will vote from election to election for the same political party. 2010 was somewhat different, and what was interesting, people were saying leaders are more important even before the television debates, which had such a huge impact on the campaign. Now, to some extent, that might be because nobody was actually trusted on any of the issues that mattered at the election. That's one of the reasons why people thought they needed to trust the leaders more.
What about the TV debates? That's always the question. When you look back on the election, that was a unique first time ever in British history, kind of dominated the election, apart from perhaps Gillian Duffy. That got more news coverage than any other events in the campaign.
It was the key moment of the campaign, made a massive difference to how the campaign was covered by the media. After the first debate, something like 48% of people who watched that first TV debate said it had some impact on their voting intention. Either it firmed up how they were going to vote anyway, or it questioned whether they were going to change for a party. Only 1% of people watched the TV debate and said they ain't going to vote for any of them, or not vote at all. So if you're interested in democratic engagement, there's certainly a good exercise. But what's really interesting...
perhaps pining for Alex Salmond, or who wasn't on the panel, or another party leader, or Caroline Lucas.
Possibly that might have been one of the reasons. But even with the TV debates, the most volatile electorate we've seen in decades, actually, how people said they were going to vote at the beginning of the campaign pretty much mirrored how they voted at the end of the campaign. Fascinating campaign. People were interested in it. It made people think again about how they were going to vote for, but where Labour and the Conservatives were in 1% of each other at the start of the campaign than they were at the end of the campaign.
And you truly believe it was a fascinating campaign? Because I remember Boris Johnson, Mayor of London, saying it was the most boring campaign he could remember.
Well, 75% of the public told us they were interested in news about the campaign. That's the highest level recorded since at least the 1980s, when the question was first asked. So I'm telling you what the public said about the campaign.
And that's partly driven by Cleggmania, do you think?
I think that's partly driven by the television debates. They clearly engaged many more people. Also driven by the fact that it was an uncertain election. It could have turned out several different ways. It didn't have to turn out with a Conservative victory with the help of the Lib Dems.
Well, we'll come on to that in a moment. Let me just, sticking with the leadership debates for a moment, is the genie now out of the bottle? I mean, there's no way we can't see similar debates in 2015, can we? We can't have... in the next election, we are guaranteed to have leadership debates, aren't we?
Well, nothing's guaranteed in politics or life, but it's pretty inconceivable that any of the party leaders would refuse to appear on a television debate. Can you imagine how they would be slaughtered, quite rightly, by the media? So I think they are here to stay. The public will expect them. The public will use them to help them decide how they're going to vote.
So the stick, Mark, that Cameron got after that first debate, when Cleggmania really took off, and the Tory party, especially the right of the Tory party, said you're absolutely mad to give over these debates because you knew you'd beat Brown, but you should have known that Clegg would be really good. In retrospect, it didn't actually make that big a difference, did it?
Well, he was mad to give over the debates because he and his party or his advisers thought, the months before the debates happened, that he would walk over Gordon Brown. But that's not really the reason the Tories failed to seal the deal. Their lead started to slip right at the turn of the year, pretty much as the posters of Cameron were plastered around on billboards, with the spin and image. His and the Tory party's lead started to slip. So I think, from a strategic point of view, it was a mistake for the Conservatives, but it wasn't the only reason.
Here's a question to you, Mark. Why is it then that so many of the pollsters didn't see that lead slipping, didn't see what was coming? I think around April last year, I think it's The Independent, I think it was Amol's paper, interviewed the eight top pollsters, including Bob Worcester from the 8 leading organisations, Ipsos Mori, ICM, All Comres, etc. All of them predicted a Tory majority. Why did they all get it wrong?
I don't think Bob Worcester was part of that panel, but I think it was the new chief exec of Mori. But anyway...
was it Ben Page?
The point is, polls don't predict the future. They measure what the public say, they think or do, or will behave tomorrow. Pollsters use that data and make their projection. So you'd have to ask each individual pollster why they couldn't forecast a year in the head. But the polls themselves just measure what you think tomorrow.
Do you think, Mark, just on your incredibly depressing observation about the importance of party leaders, which has made me feel very down already, that actually all the stuff that David Cameron got stick for quite early on, he did lots of things to rebrand the Tories, he converted the Tory logo into a green squiggle, he went riding with huskies, he gave a speech that was interpreted, though he never said it, as hugging a hoodie, he put a solar panel on his roof. Do you think actually in retrospect he was quite shrewd and quite clever to take that sort of short-term hit, to really sort of take a blow from people saying this guy's just a PR man, because he recognised the point that you're making, which is actually now it's all about, do you trust Tory leaders? And he did inherit a party that was still seen as a nasty party.
Yeah, I mean, the image making of the Conservative Party under David Cameron helped David Cameron much more than it helped the Conservative Party itself.
Yeah.
You look back at the image of the Conservatives right on the eve of the election, and they were still seen to be, by more than any of the other parties, as being extreme. But on the other hand, they were seen to have a good team of leaders and professional. But people's likeability of the Tories hardly increased.
I suppose people forget that in the 90s, Labour was outpolling Tony Blair, whereas Cameron was outpolling the Tories his own party.
Cameron not only was outpolling the Tories, more importantly, he was outpolling Gordon Brown, particularly on who was the most likeable party leader.
So sum up for me, Chapter 2, how the Conservatives failed to win it.
Well, they failed to win it because they didn't properly seal the deal in terms of changing their image. So
they should have gone further in their quote-unquote detoxification strategy.
They needed to go further in terms of being seen as a party that people wanted to support. Now, to be fair to the Conservatives, of course, their task was much harder than the Labour Party. Now, David Cameron and the Tories' lead over Labour at the last election was twice what Tony Blair achieved in 2005, yet Labour got a third term in Parliament and the Tories failed to win a majority. So, to some extent, the electoral system in 2010 was working against the Conservative Party and in favour of Labour.
On the other hand, some would argue they also had the easiest opportunity of all because they were up against the most unpopular Prime Minister in a divided government after 13 years in power and in the wake of the worst recession in living memory. So kind of cut both ways in terms of the pros and cons of last year.
The thing about Gordon Brown is he clearly was an unpopular leader. He had some strengths. He was seen as understanding world problems. He actually wasn't much differently rated to what Tony Blair was rated in 2005. His personal approval ratings ahead of the 2010 general election were almost identical to Tony Blair's ahead of the 2005 general election. The key difference was that Tony Blair was up against Michael Howard and Gordon Brown was up against David Cameron. And when people, in an election you only have one vote, and more people voted Conservative and David Cameron than Labour and Gordon Brown.
OK, well, we'll carry on this discussion in a moment. We've got Amol Rajan here with us from The Independent, who's going to be talking about his book later in the hour. We've got Mark Gill here, who's talking about his book that he's co-authored, Explaining Cameron's Coalition. You're listening to LBC 97.3. The time now is 9:15. Time for a travel update with Alan Cowie.
Mehdi, thank you. Good evening. South West trains are...
You're listening to LBC 97.3. This is the LBC Book Club. I'm Mehdi Hasan, sitting in for Ian Dale. I've got with me in the studio Mark Gill, who's the co-author of Explaining Cameron's Coalition, an analysis of the 2010 British general election, and Amol Rajan, author of Twirly Men, the unlikely history of cricket's greatest spin bowlers. Mark, we were talking just before the travel about Cameron and why he failed to kind of climb that. He climbed somewhat up that mountain but wasn't able to kind of reach the peak and get that majority. What were the other factors? You talked about him not continuing the modernisation or persuading enough people to say a change. What were the other factors that you think prevented the Tories from winning an outright majority? And how will that impinge on 2015 and the so-called Osborne strategy for the Tories winning a majority next time round?
Yeah, I think there was two key things. First of all, the expenses scandal really harmed all the political parties. Politics as a whole didn't come out of that very well. So it was difficult for the Conservatives and Cameron to argue there is some sort of new type of politics when the public were pretty disgusted with all of them. Perhaps most importantly, though, it was the economy. It was by far the most important issue people were worried about, much more than the NHS or immigration or crime. And no party had a lead on it. So the Conservatives failed to capitalise on the public unhappiness with the state of the economy.
Is that because of George Osborne, do you think? I mean, you must have done a bit of research to find out whether or not the public generally thought that he was a kind of young, naive, impish, kind of neophyte, not up to the job.
The Shadow Chancellors don't really have that much of an impact on the general public's voting intention. The point was... the Tories had a 2 or 3 point lead over Labour in being seen to have the best policies tackling the economy, but actually that's not big enough if you want to turn people from voting one party to the other.
Amol, you write about politics for The Independent, apart from writing this book on cricket. Looking back with it, kind of the benefit of hindsight, more than a year later, what still sticks in your mind about the 2010 election? Well,
it was the extraordinary false dawn of Cleggmania. I mean, it was absolutely extraordinary. I remember on a Saturday, I'm sure my editor would hate me for saying this, but I remember we had a picture of a front page with a picture of Clegg. He'd gone off to see some, I don't know, it's a student town somewhere, surrounded by thousands of...
It's in Oxford.
Was it
Don McIntyre went with him, I remember.
It might well have been
and all
Don
the crowds outside the buses, yeah.
And you had a leader of a political party in Britain surrounded by thousands of highly attractive young women, and we had a front page headline saying Mr. Popularity. It felt very weird, it felt very bizarre. And now to think in retrospect, after all we've had, local elections, AV thumping and all that stuff,
it does seem... Burning of effigies.
And I actually think Clegg's far more blameless in this than some of his critics would have. But it's extraordinary when you think about the impact that had and the extent to which it was a false dawn, a kind of illusion of change.
Part of the reason, of course, is the real attraction of Clegg was to the youngest voters, and only 44% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted. So if we forced them all to vote, Nick Clegg might have done somewhat better.
If you force them all to vote next time...
Yeah, you force them all to vote next time, the Lib Dems are finished, surely,
the thing,
political party.
The image attribute that the public most associated with the Lib Dems before the election was keeping its promises. I would love to see what the public think now. Now they've had a chance to prove whether they keep their promises or not.
On the Lib Dems, and they did end up entering government despite the kind of transformation of Clegg-Mania that Amol mentioned. At the end of the day, the man became Deputy Prime Minister. Amazing achievement for a third-party leader. Coalitions, and there's a great talk of coalitions. Now, Britain's not used to coalitions. I think it was Disraeli says England doesn't love coalition. We now have coalition politics. Your book's called Explaining Cameron's Coalition. What are the odds? What's the likelihood of another coalition in 2015? There are a lot of people who say it doesn't matter whether AV comes or goes. Given the nature of voting, people aren't voting for the two big parties. Even under our current majoritarian first-past-the-post system, you will end up with more coalitions in the future. Is that something you believe?
Well, it's likely again that there will be a coalition unless Labour or the Conservatives makes a significant change to what they're appealing to at the moment. Partly, this is related to the point about will equalising and reducing the number of constituencies make much difference? Well, actually, probably not by more than a dozen, if more.
Really? There's a story on the front of today's Guardian which says the Lib Dems are going to get crushed by all these boundary changes.
Well, in terms of the benefit to the Tories, it will have a net impact of about 8 to 10 seats over Labour, and that's really determines who's going to win the election or not. What it will do, if it definitely goes through, is that election after election, MPs will be losing and gaining different constituents. It's going to have a fairly profound impact for many people on their relationship with their Member of Parliament.
So there is the prospect, for all those people who are listening who absolutely despise Nick Clegg, the prospect of Nick Clegg being a sort of permanent kingmaker in British politics, of him having a decisive influence at the next election, is a very real one. If we're looking at coalition government, and we're not going to have a Tory rule or Labour rule, that means by implication that the Lib Dems are going to sway things.
Well, that obviously depends on what the public, in their wisdom, decides. It's pretty clear, looking at the polling evidence, the actual voting evidence, that the Lib Dems have suffered far more than the Conservatives since forming the coalition.
The human shield strategy.
Well, one of the issues, of course, is Lib Dem supporters and voters aren't used to their party having to make tough decisions. The Tories are actually polling higher in most polls than they actually received in support at the general election.
Mark, and I should point out, Mark's book is co-authored by Paul Baines, Roger Mortimer and Robert Worcester. In your book, Mark, if Ed Miliband were to pick up your book and go through it, what lesson would he learn for Labour? What's the lesson from the 2010 election in your book for the Labour Party now under his leadership?
Well, he'll learn lots of lessons, but I'll give you a couple. First of all...
As a proud author, but go on.
First of all, South and South East of England really matters. Only 16% of voters in the South East voted Labour.
16%?
16%. Labour are less popular in the South East than the Tories are in Scotland. There's a lot more seats up for grab in the South East. Secondly, you're not going to win an election by just appealing to the working class vote. There aren't enough working class people, and not enough of them will ever vote for one party over the other. In fact, more middle-class people voted Labour at the last general election than working-class people did. That had never happened before. What you read and where you live...
Hold on, I'm slightly confused. Doesn't that slightly contradict what you're saying, then? If they've already got lots of middle-class voters, and they've lost, as we've seen over the years, so-called C1, C2 working-class voters, don't they need to regain their support? Isn't that the conventional wisdom now?
Yeah, but the point is there are now fewer working-class voters in the electorate, so only 44% of the public are now defined as working class. If you go back to 1969, it was closer to two-thirds of the public, and particularly the lowest socio-economic groups are the least likely to vote. So both the Conservatives and Labour need to appeal to both working and middle-class voters. But what's really interesting, you look at gender, you look at age, you look at social class, these aren't the big things that differentiate party support these days. It's much more about what type of house you live in. It's much more about where you live in the country. South East and South West, East of England, Labour are almost negligible in terms of support. And also, there's a very high correlation with what newspaper you read.
Really?
That's good news if you work in newspapers, obviously. But doesn't that suggest, Mark, a massive identity crisis for a party that's called Labour? I mean, Labour were founded really as the kind of parliamentary representation of the unionised. Poor unions are much weaker than they used to be, but it was about the labour movement. It was about organised working people. And if you're saying that the working class as a proportion of the overall population has fallen massively, and that working class solidarity is much less a feature of life in Britain, and even more less of a feature of voting intentions, you've got a massive problem, haven't you, if you lead something that was once called the Labour movement. I mean, I know Tony Blair found a way around that, but that was by doing what a lot of people say is not particularly representing the interests of Labour.
You've got a massive problem if you only want to and think you can support to the Labour movement. But I'm sure Ed Miliband knows, as every Labour MP knows, even if they don't want to admit it, is you're not only going to get back to power if you're a broad-based support. We don't have the ideological differences that were apparent even in the 1980s,
Yeah, I agree.
not least decades before.
One quick question before we go to the news, Mark. You've got a little subsection in your book saying, could Labour have won with a different leader? What did you discover to be the answer to that question?
We don't think so. Although Gordon Brown was an unpopular leader, he did have some strengths. It was actually, to a large extent, Tony Blair's fault. The hole was dug whilst Tony Blair was Prime Minister. Gordon didn't do very much to get the party out of it. They'd had 13 years in power, as you said right at the beginning of the programme. You had the expenses scandal that destroyed the reputation of many politicians, and you had an economic crisis that affected how everybody thought about the previous government.
Okay, so Brown is not to blame. Explaining Cameron's coalition, how it came about, an analysis of the 2010 British general election is a book we're discussing. Mark Gill is one of the co-authors of that book. We've also got Amol Rajan here, author of Twirly Men. We're going to carry on the discussion after the news. You're listening to LBC 97.3.
This is LBC 9.
I'm indeed Mehdi Hasan. I'm with you till 10 o'clock with the LBC Book Club. Then Mr. Clive Bull takes over. As per normal, he is here with me. Good evening, Clive.
Hi, Mehdi. Yes, I'll be here at 10. Coming up, we're going to talk about the NHS, because David Cameron is going to talk about the NHS tomorrow, and he's going to apparently commit to these 5 promises or pledges about the NHS. And, well, we all know what we think about politicians' promises normally. So I want to know
Will they be
whether
on a little
people...
pledge card?
Well, I wondered, yes. Is he going to be believed? And what kind of promises would you like to hear him make? We're going to have a look at that and ask whether you feel the NHS is safe in David Cameron's hands. We're also going to talk about censorship and film certification and film classification in the light of a film that's in the news today that they've decided it is beyond classification. It is it's not going to get a certificate to be seen under any circumstances. But the difficulty is it probably will be seen because, the world is not controllable in that way now. So I'd like to talk about the relevance of film classification and whether there is anything that can be or should be censored now. And as we heard in the news, the iCloud, Apple has launched its iCloud. And Steve Jobs is saying that it's the future. It's as significant as the PC was 10 years ago. It's going to be the centre of everything. So I'd like to know whether you're buying into that, or do you like to own your own things and not have them in a cyber cloud? That's all coming up at 10.
Isn't everything that Apple does the future?
Well, of course. And mostly they're right, of course.
Well, there's a partisan voice there, Clive Bull, coming. He's a Mac, I'm a PC. He's coming up at 10 o'clock tonight. We're with you till then. I'm in the studio with Amol Rajan, author of Twirly Men, The Unlikely History of Cricket's Greatest Spin Bowlers. He's also with the Independent newspaper, former deputy comment editor. We've been talking to Mark Gill, co-author of Explaining Cameron's Coalition, an analysis of the 2010 British general election. Just before the news, Mark was telling us about how difficult the Labour task is, what Ed Miliband has to do to win back some of those voters in the south, some of those voters that Tony Blair won back. I just want to bring in Amol here, because Amol's written a piece, you wrote a piece today in the Independent, True Colours, is Blue Labour the way forward for the left? Tell the listeners a little bit about what you mean by Blue Labour.
Well, Blue Labour is Westminster's most fashionable current intellectual tendency. These wonderful pithy phrases come along once in a while in our politics. So in a way, it's the Labour response to Red Tory, which was something that a theologian called Philip Blond championed, and it's a bit like Big Society, which is a thing that David Cameron's very excited about. And Blue Labour is an attempt by lots of thinkers around Ed Miliband, who I know you've been speaking to about your book, Mehdi, to reawaken certain sort of dormant traditions within the Labour movement. Their feeling is that Labour was the Labour Party was a kind of marriage between, on the one hand, a sort of a cooperative and union-loving mother who believed in society and strong relationships, and on the other hand, a kind of state and big government-loving father who was sort of brutish and horrible. And they think basically the father won. And what they want to do is tame the father and nurture the mother back to health. And lots of these Labour thinkers think that basically Labour has lost touch with the working class, and it's lost touch with the kind of, if you like, conservatism of some of the working class. But as Mark was saying before the break, maybe that's not the route to
electoral victory. There's not many of them around.
It's not many of them around.
Is there any votes in Blue Labour, do you think, as someone who observes the political scene?
I think that the greatest benefit to... there are some good policies in Blue Labour. There are some policies which aim at increasing the power of poor people, which is basically why I would support them. But I think the great benefit of Blue Labour to Ed Miliband is actually to show, as Red Toryism did with Cameron, that he's on the side of ideas, that he's interested in sort of intellectual speculation, that Labour are re-examining their roots, they're thinking hard about who they are and what they represent. As I said before the break, I think Labour have got a huge problem in that Labour was founded as a party that unionised poor, and the unions weaker than they've ever been, and there are fewer poor people as defined by one particular category. So I think the great benefit of Blue Labour is a kind of branding issue, actually, rather than actually some of the insights. And I do think that Ed Miliband has got a massive problem connecting with working class people. I think lots of people think, rather unjustly in my view, that he's just a complete weirdo from Primrose Hill. So anything that gets him back on the side of the poor, which Blue Labour may well do, might be quite clever in terms of short-term politics.
Although, interestingly, he represents a heavily working-class constituency in Doncaster North. Quite interesting. But yes, he does look as a Primrose Hill lad. Mark Gill, are there votes in Blue Labour?
Well, it's a very interesting intellectual discussion. But I don't think, if you ask the public, are you Blue Labour, Red Tory, Yellow Green,
Purple Labour,
people will never talk in those senses. Just as, lots of politicians and commentators don't realise that most of us don't talk in left or right terms either. So actually, however you define it or brand it, he needs to be talking first of all about the economy, which clearly we've had lots of news about that today and yesterday, and also looking at how the coalition is performing some of the key public services. And I'm absolutely certain that most important of these is the NHS. The NHS to the British is like what cricket is to the Caribbean. We love the NHS. One of my favourite polls conducted in 2000 asked the public, what's the single biggest achievement of any government in the 20th century? Yeah. Not in the 20th century. The NHS came out top, ahead of establishing the welfare state, ahead of universal adult suffrage, ahead of winning the Second World War. So the Tories, and I think this is why the Prime Minister is really going to focus on it tomorrow and try and regain trust, know that this is a particular weak point.
So Mark, here I was sitting, twiddling my thumbs, wondering how I was going to perform the screeching handbrake turn from coalition politics into Amol's book about spin bowlers, and you gave it to me there with the NHS
on a plate.
with the NHS being as popular to us as cricket is in the Caribbean. Amol, aside from writing about politics and Blue Labour, you've actually taken time out to write this book. It's called Twirly Men: The Unlikely History of Cricket's Greatest Spin Bowlers. Why did you write this book?
Well, actually, I'm sure all your lovely listeners would love to know that this is actually basically an extended apology to myself, because I had great ambitions, as I'm sure we all had, Mehdi, and I can see the twinkle in your eyes, even as I say this, that I quite fancied the idea of being a leg spinner for England when I was growing up.
Can't think of anything more boring, but go on.
Well, dear me, you haven't watched enough cricket. Alas, I was slightly too incompetent and indolent and injury-prone, otherwise known as fat, to achieve this grand ambition of mine. So I had this great fascination and wondered what to do with it. And I thought the clever thing to do would be to write a book celebrating what is, as you know, with your deep knowledge of cricket, the single most beautiful art form in a sport already characterised by beauty. So it's a history of a kind of wonderful species of cricketing.
But as you said, it's a beautiful art form, it's a beautiful sport. But what makes spin bowlers stand out from the rest?
Spinning and spin bowlers requires a certain weirdness. It's a very weird thing when you pick up a small spherical object that fits in your hand. It's a very, very weird and peculiar mindset that says, you know what I'm going to do? Rather than try and hurl this down and take the head off a batsman by bowling as fast as I can, I'm actually going to slow things down. I'm going to snap my fingers a bit, and I'm going to try and spin the batsman out. That takes a certain sort of weirdness, a certain sort of eccentricity, a certain sort of unpredictable nature. And so spinners have tended to be some of the great eccentrics of the game. They've often been far more intellectually contemplative, they've been far more cerebral, they've been far more kind of just intellectually inclined than many of the other great eccentrics of the game. And although wicket keepers are also complete and utter weirdos, I think you could basically safely say that spinners were the great weirdos, not just of cricket, but possibly of all sport too.
But the romantics as well.
The romantics too, yeah. I mean, they end up crying and declaring love for each other. And there's also a great sense down the ages that that spin bowlers have been persecuted. You know, we've had shorter boundaries, covered wickets. We've got double-sided bats these days, TV replays that help batsmen. There is a sense in which spinners have felt like a persecuted species for a very long time. And partly my motivation in writing the book was that when I was, growing up, there was this extraordinary sort of cast of spinners. You had Shane Warne, the great Australian. You had this fantastic Sri Lankan guy called Matthias Muralitharan. He probably chucked it, but it was still wonderful to watch. And if you'd grown up sort of in the 1980s, watching all these fantastic West Indians, some of whom are featured in that brilliant film called Fire in Babylon, which is out at the moment, you'd have probably wanted to be a fast bowler. But growing up in the 90s, you realise that actually spin bowling is just about the sexiest thing you can do in all sport.
You talk about spin bowlers being persecuted, and then you take a little in your own book, don't you take a little dig at medium and fast bowlers? You refer to them as having, quote, all the romance of genital warts.
Well, I think an author's allowed a bit of hyperbole once in a while, Mehdi, as you well know from your columns in New Statesman. But broadly speaking, I think that fast bowling is exceptionally boring and mundane and intellectually docile compared to the eccentricities of spin.
Is it fair to say that there are more spinners around these days than there were when you and I were growing up in the 80s?
Very much so.
Why?
Well, we sort of went through this very fallow period. I think the advent of one-day cricket, limited overs cricket generally in the late 70s and early 80s meant that fast bowling dominated the scene. And then we just had this extraordinary renaissance. And I think that was largely actually driven by these two characters I mentioned, Shane Warne and Matthias Muralitharan. You've also just had a slight sort of weakening of the West Indian side. I mean, the West Indies were the great sort of cricketing nation in the 1980s and are now kind of in the second or third rank of cricket side. So we're sort of readdressing the balance. But it's true to say that fast bowling still dominates, and I think that's a great shame.
I was in the Caribbean when Brian Lara scored his 400 record.
Dear me.
And the country went wild, and the Prime Minister then decided to give the country a public holiday. And that's a politician that knows how to tap into populist sentiment.
Absolutely. And I think there is I can't imagine Shane Warne taking all 10 wickets and the Australians doing that, but I think there is something wonderful about the idea that a country would go on holiday in response to some grand cricketing feat. I only wish that the English would do it against Sri Lanka at Rainy Lords just this week.
You mentioned Matthias Muralitharan. You said he probably chucked it.
Yeah.
Is that from your own? Is that received wisdom? Is that something you've discovered in your
extensive scientific research I've undertaken? Is it? No, on my own. Most people think that Murali was this extraordinary phenomenon because he's got all sorts of bizarre defects. If you sort of, if any of your listeners are driving their cars, I'd advise against doing this. But if they're not, and they extend out their hand, and you try and touch your wrist with your fingers, you'll find that actually you can't bend your wrist nearly as much as you need to get your fingers to touch your inner arm. Murali could do that. He had this extraordinary wrist. He also had a very bizarre elbow and a very bizarre shoulder. So he had lots of natural advantages, but I think he probably obtained an unfair advantage from the fact that he extended his arm as much as he did. Most bowlers, don't bowl with a completely straight arm, but Murali, especially for his other ball called the doosra, which spins away from the right-hander, extended his arm about 22 or 23 degrees. And I'm a bit of an old fogey insofar as I wish bowlers bowl with straight arms, because that way they could all be judged on the same level playing field.
You mentioned doosra. Tell us, what is that?
Doosra is an Urdu word meaning other one. So you've got off spinners and leg spinners. Off spinners spin the ball into the right hander, leg spinners spin it away. A doosra is a ball which really sort of once again came to prominence in the 1990s, which is the off spinner's delivery that actually goes the other way. It means the other one. It's the one that rather than spinning into the right hander goes the other way, which has caused all sorts of problems, not just for the batsmen who've had to face it, but also for most of the bowlers who've taken it up, because it's a bit like a hallucinogenic drug, the doosra. It makes you feel great for a little while, and soon you have a very massive come down. And most of the bowlers who've experimented with the doosra abandon it because it ended up ruining their action. And so ruining their careers too.
Amol, we will carry on this discussion. Amol is the author of Twirly Men, The Unlikely History of Cricket's Greatest Spin Bowlers. You're listening to LBC 97.3. The time now is 9:45. Time for a travel update with Alan Cowie.
Thank you, Mehdi. Good evening. Still not looking too good on the...
You're listening to LBC. This is the LBC Book Club. I'm Mehdi Hasan, sitting in for Ian Dell. I'm with you till 10 o'clock. I've got Mark Gill here with me in the studio, who's the author of Explaining Cameron's Coalition, and Amol Rajan, author of Twirly Men, The Unlikely History of Cricket's Greatest Spin Bowlers. Before the travel, you was telling us about the doosra. What are the other types of spin bowling and tricks and techniques that you came across in your research for the book, or just from your own following of the game?
Well, there's some 9 chapters in the book, and in between each one we've got a little interlude with a diagram showing some of the variations. You have leg breaks, googlies, top spinners, zooters, sliders, doosra, caramball, and even a Rajan's mystery ball, which I came up with all by myself, Mehdi, and which I heartily recommend.
And did you draw them all as yourself?
We did. Well, I got someone else to draw them all, but very impressive they look too. But the amazing thing is actually, spin bowlers spread a huge amount of fear by talking about their variations. Often, Shane Warne would put it about before he came over for an Ashes tour that he bowled 16 different deliveries, which of course could just mean, the same delivery bowled from 16 marginally different points on the bowler's crease. The main thing is you can talk about these deceptions to spread a huge amount of propaganda and lies about what you're capable of doing. So as long as spinners talk a good game, they're likely to win one too. Your
book is partly about the resurgence of spin bowling, and yet when we talked about why you got into it, why you wrote the book, who were the people who dominated, it's people like Shane Warne and Mutai Muralitharan. They're not around now. So what's the disconnect there? Who epitomises, who's leading the resurgence today?
Well, actually, one of the most remarkable things is it's an Englishman. I mean, the English have not often been associated with producing great spinners, which of course is a kind of myopic way of looking at it. But it's a chap called Graham Swan who's taken wickets all over the place, who's a fantastic character, a live wire in the dressing room, and he's probably the best spinner in the world. And if you'd have told me when I first had the idea of writing the book a few years back that by the time I concluded it, the best spinner in the world would be an Englishman, I'd have thought you were completely mad. But of course, Swan is only reawakening a sort of long established tradition of great English spin bowlers, and there's no one that he looks like more than the great Jim Laker, who's a chap who took 19 of the Australian wickets against Australia at Old Trafford in 1956. So it's wonderful that the man leading the charge is an Englishman, but as it happens, if you look at the whole history of spin, that's not quite as weird as you might otherwise have thought.
Just on the subject of the book itself, you mentioned, over the time it took you, you came up with the idea, you mentioned your own passions as a child. How hard was it to kind of sell this idea for people at budding authors? Is this your first book?
It is my first book, yeah.
It's quite an interesting choice for a first book for someone like yourself who writes about blue Labour and politics, worked at the Independent. How did you come up with the idea and go to a publisher and persuade them that a book about spin bowlers with diagrams would work?
I was very lucky in that I've got a fantastic agent called Andrew Gordon at David Hyam, and he approached me and suggested we had a chat about interesting book ideas. And I think the state of publishing, as you well know, as we all know, is tricky, and you've got to work out a market where you've got a clearly identified bunch of people who have an interest and who are regular buyers of a book. And it just so happens to be the case that there was this lovely kind of marriage between my interests intellectually and sort of personally in terms of my childhood, and the fact that cricket lovers tend to buy books about cricket. It's just a sort of wonderful thing. And within that market of people who buy books about cricket, spin bowling was a neglected but very interesting area. So I suppose I got lucky in one sense, but you can blame my agent for that.
Would you write another book about cricket?
I think I might well do, yeah. I was thinking, I don't know what you think about this, I was thinking about writing a biography of the resurgence of India. There's something wonderful about the Indian cricket team and the symmetry between the Indian cricket team, or maybe one particular individual within it. And so that on the one hand, and also the amazing rise of India as a sort of geopolitical player. I was thinking about that. But as you know, and as we were talking about from Blue Labour, my great interest is politics and philosophy, so maybe something on those for book number 2.
What would you say to those people who say that, especially through the antics of certain people in the subcontinent, particularly the Pakistani team, that cricket as a whole has been brought into serious disrepute in recent months and years?
Well, I think that the Indian Premier League, and certainly people I've spoken to at sort of the top of cricket would say that the Indian Premier League is far, far more corrupt than most fans of the game would ever imagine, or would ever want the sport that they love to be. Whenever you have a sudden, it's a bit like the the East Asian tiger crisis in the late 90s. Whenever you have a flood of capital into a market that hasn't really been readied for it, you create large amounts of problems. And we have this sudden influx of billions and billions of pounds within India, this huge market, and it's very, very exciting on the one hand, but with it comes, I'm afraid, really quite sickening and concerning corruption. And I'm afraid to say that 2020 on the subcontinent is a deeply, deeply corrupt sport, and I think we should all be braced for some really horrible stories to emerge over the next months.
And this is a difficult thing for politicians to deal with, looking at football as well, because on the one hand, the public, want their national leaders to take some leadership on these issues, but mixing politics and sport can be very dangerous, and lots of people recoil from it. So it's almost a lose-lose situation.
Are you a cricket fan, Mark?
Well, I'm a Yorkshire man, so I have to like cricket
I'll take that
to
as a
some
yes.
extent.
But do you think the game's been tainted in recent years, given developments on and off the pitch?
Well, without a doubt, there are not only more allegations, but also more provable corrupt events. It's not necessarily a gentleman's game that it once was, and as we said, this is largely driven by money and power.
But also you have some extraordinary stories in the subcontinent, not just India, but in Pakistan and Sri Lanka as well. Really sort of moving, tragic stories of players who don't have the best education, who are sort of these prodigal talents that sort of are picked up from the back streets of Rawalpindi or Bangalore, who are the great hope of their families and who are sort of brought into prominence nationally, play a few games, and then are sort of taken in by these gangsters and extortionists who say, you must do this, this or this. And, they're completely and utterly vulnerable. And what sort of really concerns me, and I think should concern anyone who sort of worries about corruption in sport, is the fact that they don't seem to get much protection, and they don't seem to get much kind of help from the management of these various places. So, the Pakistani Cricket Board is a disgustingly corrupt place, which is consistently doing over players that really ought not to be done over. Similarly, in India, you've got the BCCI, which is the Board of Cricket Control, which is run by a bunch of oligarchs in effect, and in Sri Lanka the president Rajapaksa seems to select the national side. So when you've got that degree of influence from politicians and you've got this influx of money, you've got a recipe for disaster.
And you've got rising powers, so it's very hard for Western countries to try and tell them what to do.
Yeah, and you've got players like Andrew Flintoff, and who could blame him? Lots of players from over here are thinking, why should I bother with the county game when I could get paid a huge amount of money for playing a bit of this kind of, I used to call 2020 rounders for kids, but it's actually rounders for adults because they're making a lot of money very, very quickly.
But to be fair, lots of the new forms of the game have encouraged more people to watch it, to participate in it. I mean, there has been, not only, I think, because England have done somewhat better in recent years, something of a resurgence in public interest in cricket, which is healthy for the sport here and for...
When you say new forms of the game, as someone who's not a regular follower of cricket, do you mean shorter forms of the game? Because one of my problems with cricket has always been the idea that it goes on longer than a day.
Well, there's certainly different forms of the games that don't necessarily take 5 days. So, 2020 matches, different types of limiters over. So you can even go and watch it on an evening, take your family there in a beautiful summer evening and watch a game of cricket, and you'll actually get a result before the sun goes
Mehdi,
down.
I'm certain that if you took your wife and your lovely little 4-year-old along to Middlesex or something near where you live, they would absolutely love an evening... 2020, short form of the game, big turnaround, wickets, runs.
My wife's an American.
They
They stop the game every 2 seconds for ads and have to have basketball scores every 30 seconds. Football is too slow for the Yanks.
There's a wonderful line in Joseph O'Neill's book, Netherland, where he says, which is all about playing cricket in New York, he says, there's a limit to what Americans understand, and that limit is cricket. I think he's basically right.
One last question to Amol before we wrap up tonight. You mentioned a few names. Who is, for our listeners' purposes, as you're the man who's written the expert on this now, you've written the book on it, who is the greatest spin bowler of all time?
Oh, unquestionably Shane Warne, and whose many charms extend to the fact that he's currently dating Liz Hurley, which is yet another reason to make him a hero of mine. But Shane is unquestionably the greatest bowler that we've ever had. Maybe not the most complete. There are others who did more varied skills, but in terms of who is the person that a batsman would most fear, isn't it a wonderful thing that the person a batsman would most fear is not someone like one of the great West Indian quicks who'd take his head off, but this beach bum from Melbourne with peroxide blonde hair, who is massively overweight and who said that his idea of a balanced diet was a cheeseburger on each hand. That's my definition of greatness, and that is the great Shane Warne.
That's my definition of a balanced diet as well. Amol Rajan, author of Twirly Men, The Unlikely History of Cricket's Greatest Spin Bowlers. It's published by Yellow Jersey Press. It's out now in hardback. Mark Gill, co-author of Explaining Cameron's Coalition, an analysis of the 2010 British general election, published by Biteback. Thanks to you both for joining us on LBC 97.3.
Thanks very much indeed.
I just spoke to Jeff. Nice bloke.